So in previous videos we covered the Chrysler Firepower series, then we did the DeSoto Fire Dome, Fireflight, and now it's time to do the Dodge. The Red Ram, the Super Red Ram, and there's a lot of confusion with the name Power Giant. We'll get to that in a second. The thing I want to say before we get into this video about these early Hemis is that in their day they were designed for efficiency. They were designed for good pedestrian type of performance and efficiency. Mostly they needed to run really good on marginal gas under the worst conditions, and that's how they were designed. But their basic architecture led to them being able to make extreme horsepower when supercharged on nitromethane. All of these engines were run on nitro at one time or another. The Chrysler especially, it was the mainstay of top fuel for decades. But the DeSoto also to some extent, and the Dodge Red Ram. Land speed cars. They still use the Red Ram in some fuel-burning land speed cars today. They're tough. They're really tough engines. They fell out of favor in the 1960s because the definition of performance changed. And street performance engines started getting bigger and bigger bores. And all of the early Chrysler Hemis are known, they're all built around small bore architecture, long stroke, small bore architecture. They're great torque engines. But here's the thing. Even though they're antiquated and their output on gasoline, normally aspirated gasoline, is very limited, in today's world with nitrous oxide, turbocharging, supercharging, these engines are extremely viable. They were all built from the best of materials. The engineering on them, the geometry, everything is first rate. So you can look at them as being, just antiquated curiosities. They're great street rod engines, that sort of thing, normally aspirated on gasoline. But if you really want to step on something, they're capable of doing it. The Firepower, the Chrysler engines were known to live 2,000 horsepower. Fine, they'll take it all day long. Now, obviously, they require some modification, some beefing up. But the bottom line is that they're capable of it. Same thing with the DeSotos, and same thing with the little Dodges. So, let's talk about the Dodge. We'll get to the name confusion in a minute. So, the Chrysler was introduced in 51. 1952, they brought out the DeSoto version. The difference between the Chrysler and the DeSoto, the main difference, was that the DeSoto is 2 inches smaller in every dimension. So it's 2 inches narrower, 2 inches lower, okay? And the DeSoto is what the modern small block and the Magnum evolved from. The Dodge, introduced in 1953, is smaller by 2 inches in every dimension from the DeSoto. So you've got the big Chrysler, the mid-sized DeSoto, and the tiny Dodge. The Dodge Red Ram Hemis they look large, but they're really actually smaller. The blocks are physically smaller than even a small block Mopar. They fit in really tight locations. Again, like the DeSoto, with the exhaust coming down from under the cylinder heads instead of out from the sides, you can make these things fit in places even a small block won't fit. So, but let's talk about the Dodge. Introduced 1953. Low compression, was a 7-to-1 motor, 241 cubic inches. Now here's what I'll do is, as I come across specific things from these engines, I'll bring them out. The initial run of 241s in 1953, the initial run were known for having crankshaft problems. The crankshafts would break. They wouldn't turn or do anything like that, but they would actually snap. I did as much research as I could into these engines way back when, right at the dawn of the internet, and could never really find a specific reason for it, but there was a recall on those engines because they were breaking crankshaft. Chrysler made a revision to them, and then that problem went away. So from 1953, mid-1953 on, there were no problems in the bottom end of these engines. I suspect it had something to do with the damper, or how they were balancing or damping the engines in that initial run. But that was the only failure point to those. So, introduced at 241 cubic inches. In 2 years later, in 1855, they increased it to 270 cubic inches. Just a bore increase. Now here's another idiosyncrasy with the initial, the low deck or the initial Red Ram engines, the 241 and the 270. Unlike all of the other Hemis, the early Hemis, they don't have motor mount gears. So here's what all of these engines have in common. All of them have the same bolt pattern as a small block Mopar, which is the same bolt pattern as a Gen 3 Hemi on the back. You know, the Bellhausen bolt pattern. They all have extended flange crankshafts. They all have 8-bolt crankshafts. And the flex plate or flywheel that would fit that crankshaft is the same as a 426 Hemi. So they have all of that in common. Now the Chrysler and the DeSoto have the same motor mount ears, mounting points, as the small block, and then later the Magnum. So they will literally bolt in with factory parts to any car that would take a small block Mopar. The first Dodges, the 241 and the 270, didn't have those lugs. For some reason, Dodge decided to stick with what they called the floating power mount system. So this was something that they were using on the inline sixes at the time. And instead of having ears on the side of the block, motor mounts like that, it has a cradle that has the mount under the crankshaft pulley. So mounting the earliest of these engines into a regular car is a little tricky. There are kits on the market, there's workarounds for it and all, but it's the only, those 241s and 270s are the only early Hemis that don't take regular small block motor mounts. Now that's just something to be aware of if you're going to dig into one of these engines. So initially, 2-barrel low compression engines. 1956, they raised the deck. They increased the stroke and raised the deck, and now you have the 315. And this is where performance engines start to come around. You've got your 4-barrel and dual 4-barrel versions. Now, I'm going to get into all of that in a separate video, right? Because I want to cover the D500 and the D501 specifically. So I'm not going to get too much into the factory performance packages of these engines until I get to that video. Interesting trivia for you guys. Arnie the Farmer Beswick was known as the Pontiac guy. Actually, his first race car was a D501 Dodge. So, and I'll get into all of that too when we do the Dodge video. All right. So that's where, with the 315 is where you started to get into performance packages with these engines. And then there was one more bore increase to 325, 1957. So 1957, 1958, you had the 325 available also. So you've got two versions of it. You got the low deck version, the 241 and the 270, and you got the 12 deck version, the 315 and the 325. All of those engines are suitable for performance, but those 12 deck motors are a little bit, they're more ready to go out of the box. But they've all got the same cylinder heads, same combustion chambers, the same basic architecture of you know, the early Hemi line. Fantastic little motors. Now the name, okay, so there's a lot of confusion with the name. They introduced the motor in 1953 as the Red Ram, okay. 53, 54, they called it a Red Ram. When Dodge brought out their polyhead engine, and now I'm going to cover the polyheads in a whole other completely separate video because they're very interesting engines. They actually have a lot of untapped potential. When Dodge released their Polysphere version, they switched the Red Ram name to the Polysphere. And so the Hemi, only it wasn't called the Hemi back then, it was called a dual rocker shaft engine. It's important to know if you start digging into old literature on these engines, you're starting to look at 1950s Chrysler literature. They don't refer to them as Hemi and Polysphere. They refer to them as dual rocker shaft for the Hemi and single rocker shaft for the Polysphere. So when they introduced the Polysphere, which Plymouth also used in 1955, but that's a whole other thing, not the DeSoto-based Polysphere that evolved into the A motor, but Plymouth actually used the Dodge Polysphere, the smaller one. I'll do a whole video on Polyspheres. So the Red Ram name was for the Hemi in 53, 54, 55, they brought in the Polysphere. The Polysphere now became the Red Ram, and the Hemi became the Super Red Ram. That could throw a lot of people because you see, like on this engine here, it says Super Red Ram, and you're expecting like super engine, right? Dual quads and all this stuff. That's 2-barrel carburetor. All dual rocker shaft hemispherical engines were Super Red Ram, and the Polysphere became the regular Red Ram. This gets even more confusing in 1958, because in 1958 they started bringing the B engine, or the big block in. And so the Red Ram name got transferred to that. Oh, it's an alphabet soup of name stuff, right? So, but it did add confusion because now you had the dual rocket shaft motor, the single rocket shaft motor, and then you had the wedge engine, and they bounce those names around. And then when you're talking about the Dodge line, as far as naming goes, you'll see the Power Giant. Power Giant was the name that Dodge used for its truck engines. So in the Power Giant Dodge series, you'll find the Dodge Hemi, you'll find the Dodge Wedge, but you'll also find the Chrysler 354, which they call the Power Giant. So it's very possible by 1958 or even 1959, a lot of people don't know, the Hemi was actually available for truck and industrial marine use after 1958 when it was canceled for the cars. So you can actually find a Dodge, a 58, 59 Dodge truck that'll have a 354 Chrysler Hemi in it. It'll be labeled as a Dodge Power Giant. Lots of names and confusions and stuff. So I can't do a video on the Red Ram or the Dodge Hemi without talking about a mysterious and interesting quirk in the engine's history. So now you have to remember, before the internet, right? So let's say before like 1995, 1996, when everybody had access to internet. And dogs barking. I'm shooting here at the house now because the shop, I'm in limbo at the moment. We're still moving from the old shop to the new shop and moving stuff around, so we're working out here at the house. All right. Sorry about that. It's life at home. Before the internet, we didn't have pictures of things. We could only really speculate and whatever was printed in books and magazines. So the legend, the lore, was that after Chrysler ended production of the Hemi engines, Toyota bought several Red Ram Hemis from Chrysler and also some tooling. Now in 1964, Toyota introduced what they called their V-Series engine. So this was it was a Hemi. It was a small cubic inch, very small cubic inch, small size Hemi, V8 Hemi, a pushrod engine. So in pre-internet days, the speculation was that Toyota bought the rights, the tooling for the Red Ram and started producing it on its own in this Crown series. So the Crown series in Japan for the JDM market was like a high-end car. It was a top-of-the-line car. And when they introduced it in 1964, it had this V8, this Hemi in it, a pushrod Hemi. So like I said, before the internet, everybody was convinced that all Toyota did was take the Red Ram and then put their name on it and stick it in these cars. Now that V-Series engine kept evolving, and it actually was in production until like 1997 or 1998. So it had a really long run. And it was originally available in the Crown and then later in a car called the Century. And again, Japanese domestic market cars, very high end. Now, like I said, the speculation amongst Mopar people was that they just kept the Red Ram Hemi, they just renamed it and kept it going. But they didn't. Once pictures of those engines started to circulate, you could see that it clearly wasn't a Red Ram Hemi, it wasn't a Dodge Hemi. The most obvious thing is a distributor location. The distributor is in the front, biased towards the driver's side, like a Buick engine would have. So, well, leaning to that direction. So that was the first cue. And then the second cue is the spark plug placement. So the spark plugs, what they did was on each bank of the engine, the spark plugs are in the front two cylinders, the spark plugs are to the left of the valves. And at the back two cylinders, the spark plugs are to the right of the valves. So you have this odd spacing for a Hemi, this odd spark plug spacing for a Hemi, where the two center ones are close to each other. The only other Hemi that I could think of, known Hemi that I could think of that has a similar situation is the Arden flathead conversion, the Hemi heads for those things, because again, odd spark plug spacing, they're not evenly spaced. So as it turns out, man, I'm just running off on tangents here. As it turns out, Toyota bought several Red Ram Hemis and then modified it to their use. They kept, the combustion chamber was the same, The basic valve train was the same. They changed a few things, I guess it's like the spark plug placement and so on and so forth. But they worked with Yamaha, and it was a combination of Toyota and Yamaha that reconfigured the Red Ram into this Toyota V Series engine. And it's all aluminum, was the other thing too. The engines are aluminum block, aluminum head. And when you look at the castings, they don't even resemble the Chrysler ones, other than obviously the combustion chambers. But that's not where it ends. That's not where it ends. Because in the 70s, and I'm old enough to remember being a mechanic in the 70s, we were convinced, we were absolutely convinced that Toyota had copied Chrysler directly because of the 2T and 3TC engines. So these were four-cylinder engines, 1600cc and 1800cc, I'm not sure exactly, but their designation was T-Series engines. And they started importing them in 1970, just ahead of the Japanese invasion. You know, we won't get into all of the stuff with that. But if you look at a 2TC or a 3TC Toyota engine, you will literally see the cylinder head and rockers, because it's a push rod engine before they went to overhead cams. You'll literally see the cylinder head, push rods, rockers from a Red Ram Hemi. Even the bolt pattern on the valve cover is the same. They slightly reconfigured it, obviously, to fit on a cross-flow inline four-cylinder. Those engines had iron blocks, aluminum heads. But it's the lineage back to the Dodge Red Ram is clear with those engines. And they ran really hard, and they're still used in some series today. So yeah, there is definitely a relationship, a family relationship between the Dodge series of Hemis and certain engines that Toyota has produced over the years. And the Red Ram was definitely influential in that Toyota motor, which was one of the engines that in the Toyota models was just the right engine, the right package, the right time. You had the Arab oil embargo, you had all of that nonsense that happened, and the gas lines, and suddenly it was the Japanese invasion. So I guess it was them getting even before World War II, right? They took our industry, and those Hemis, those 2TC, 3TC engines were a big part of it. Man, there is so much. This video is really starting to go long now. There is so much I could cover, like the little details, and I will over time, because I do want to do a video on the polyheads. I want to do a video on the D500s, D501s. There's so much of this to cover, but I don't want to do it all in one video, and I don't want to do it all in 1 week. So a couple of weeks we'll go back and we'll talk about the polyheads, and then we'll do something on the D500s. So that's it. I hope you got something out of that. I have to get back to moving stuff. I'm totally occupied with moving things at the moment, so we haven't been doing many videos. But we'll be back on a regular schedule soon. And we're also working on a podcast. I'm not going to talk about it now. We'll talk about it in a future video. That's it, guys. See you tomorrow.